everyone, and welcome to another Bible study and episode review in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm, of course, Shady Oak, and today we're going to be discussing episode 6 of season 9 of the TV show My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, the episode Common Ground. If you could join me in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verses 1 through 5, Paul the Apostle is going to be our illustration in which we're going to parallel Quibble Pants' approach to gaining the approval of his stepdaughter, not only based on a true story in real life, but also that parallels quite nicely with a historical event in that Paul's ministry to the Corinthian church, the church in Corinth. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 1. And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or wisdom declaring to you the testimony of God, for I determined not to know anything among you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling, and my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom. I didn't pretend I knew everything, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should be in the wisdom of men, but the power of God. Paul the Apostle, in noting this introduction to the Corinthian church, as well as what we saw in today's episode, showed that he had as uphill a battle to win as Quibble Pants did in his ministry to the church of Corinth. Not only was the culture as far from knowing God as they possibly could be, but even culturally there couldn't have been a greater difference between Paul, his cultural background as a Jew, and the Corinthians, who were about as Greek as you possibly could be. They had been Greek, separate from the Jewish nation, since the day it was founded. So you ask the question, how did Paul minister effectively to the Corinthian church? And minister just means to serve. A minister is a servant. Well, we want to outline this in 3 basic points. More a cautionary tale to an exemplary one. Paul made the right decisions where Quibble Pants kind of had to learn the hard way, but I want you to follow along with me. First and foremost, he didn't do so by making himself out to be Jesus. Just like Quibble Pants did himself no favors in the eyes of his stepdaughter in making himself out to be sporty. Paul knew that he would have done the Greeks at Corinth no favors if he made himself out to be someone he wasn't. He could have kept up a facade for a time, and perhaps had always had the excuse of being of higher moral fiber than the Corinthians, but in the end, what was the only thing that wouldn't have disappointed them? Why did Paul choose not to teach anything to them except Jesus and what he had done? Well, you're not settling for less than perfection. The only thing that he set out to do with them was the real deal. And much like Quibble made more progress pointing Wendy to Team Ponyville than trying to perform buckball himself, listen to what Paul himself reminded the Corinthian church of in the example that he set. This is 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1. Follow me as I follow Christ. So note, Paul's not the example. He's making Jesus his example and says, so long as I'm following that, then follow me. If I'm not following Christ, then follow him, because he's the real focus here. And that's what brings us to the second point. What did Paul do in ministering to the church of Corinth? Not by making himself out to be Jesus, but by not putting on a charade and making himself out to be someone he wasn't, as was stated before. Like Quibble Pants' failure to gain his stepdaughter's approval, Paul avoided this mistake entirely by knowing where the line was to be drawn in relating to people. What do I mean? Well, let's just hear it from his words. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. So his goal is to win the most number of people possible, but notice how he does it. To those and to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. And to those who are without law, as without law. Now he clarifies. Ready? Not being without law toward God, but under law towards Christ, that I might win those who are without law. So basically he's talking about those who aren't under the same cultural background as him, who don't observe Sabbath, who don't go to the festivals, who aren't circumcised, who aren't Jewish by blood, but still want to worship Jesus in their heart. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So there will be some who say yes even if you do it perfectly, or that will say no. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you. So where was the distinction? Paul made relating to the Greeks and to the Jews in exactly those terms. He didn't become Saul to the Jews and Paul to the Greeks. He wasn't a different person. He was the same Paul in a new, catch this, culture and setting. He didn't abandon his moral standards and become a pagan. He showed them that Greeks could love Jesus too. To the Jews, he showed them how to love Jesus as Jews. Now notice, same Paul, same goal, different setting. To the Greeks, he showed as Paul to Greeks how to love Jesus. Same goal, same individual, different setting. That's the difference. He didn't abandon his moral standards. The whole point of why he was there in the first place was to do what? It was to show people that Jesus loved them. And that's our third point. He met them where they were at in order to do what? To establish a relationship, just like Quibble Pants and his goal with his stepdaughter. Paul's goal was to bring them to Jesus, and that was the setting, the focus, and the goal. And so long as that was the conversation, understand this, then it was as relevant to them as buckball in book format was to Quibble and his stepdaughter. I'm not here to become Shady Oak in order to win bronies to Christ. I'm here to show Christ with my fellow bronies on common ground. MLP is where we both are, setting-wise. But this is not a charade. My love for my fellow human beings and my desire to share something I love is done in terms we both understand. The terms don't change. The setting is what we're talking about here. And so if I can understand their language, if I can minister more effectively to my crowd, then I happily do so. For what purpose? Not to make them more fanatical bronies, but to use the common ground we have as bronies to point them to Christ. And so long as I don't forget to go where I intend to with these things, with this topic, then my purpose in doing these studies has been accomplished. I do it out of love for you. I do it out of a desire to point you to Jesus. Who I am remains the same. But when we're talking about different terms, different topics, different settings, that's the open ground for adjustment, so to speak. When Paul was speaking to the Corinthians, he didn't behave like a Corinthian in that it was a cultural term referring to someone who was just blackout drunk 7 days a week. He was referring to someone who in that culture and setting would be able to use common terms they understood. So if I'm talking to a brony, what changes? Me, my goal, or how I communicate? If I'm speaking to someone who doesn't speak English, does the message change? Does the messenger change? Or does the way I communicate the first two adjust itself? I don't compromise those two. I focus on the one, just like with Paul did, just like what Paul did, and just like what Quibble Pants learned the hard way. So with all that said, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this study. If you have sincere questions, want some of these things clarified, leave them in the comments below. I always encourage sincerity, and that will always be met with clarity. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who has seen today's episode but perhaps not these messages, please share it with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you. And to all of my fellow Christians out there, remember that's what we have to share with people. And if you can meet people in those settings, you can use terms that they would relate to, then by all means win them more to Christ. But remember, that is our goal. Don't put on a charade. Don't put out a fake image of yourself. And certainly don't make yourself out to be more than you are. Simply preach Christ and Him crucified. And in whatever terms, in whatever language that's going to be understood, don't do so at the cost of truth. Do so in order to more clearly present it.